Welcome to Day 3 of ASE's 2021 virtual experience, A Revolution in Cardiovascular Imaging. I'm Mike Main, chair of this year's program committee. This morning, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Madhav Swaminathan, immediate past president of ASE, who will present the 32nd annual ASE Edler Lecture. This lecture was created in 1990 to honor Inge Edler, MD, the founder of cardiac ultrasound over 50 years ago. Dr. Swaminathan completed his medical school education and training in anesthesiology and critical care in New Delhi, India. He also completed a scholarship in cardiac anesthesia at the UCL system in Belgium and a cardiac fellowship in Belfast, United Kingdom, before coming to Duke University in 2000 to complete a fellowship in cardiothoracic anesthesia, including a research year. He was the director of the perioperative echo service at Duke for 9 years and the clinical director of the Division of Cardiothoracic Anesthesia and Critical Care Medicine for 5 years. He is currently a tenured professor of anesthesiology at Duke University and the vice chair for faculty development in the Department of Anesthesiology. He has been an active member of the American Society of Echocardiography since 2000. He has served the ASE as the chair of the Council on Perioperative Echocardiography and chair of the membership committee, and has co-authored several national guideline documents. More recently, Dr. Swaminathan was the first anesthesiologist selected to deliver the prestigious 16th annual Feigenbaum Lecture at the ASE Scientific Sessions in Boston in 2015. He also served the ASE as president from 2019 to 2020, becoming the first ever anesthesiologist in this role. Dr. Swaminathan is active on social media, which he promotes for professional development and education. His research interests, apart from perioperative echocardiography, include cardiac surgery-associated acute kidney injury, in which he has successfully received competitive federal and industry grants. In addition to over 200 abstracts and publications, he is also the co-editor of the popular textbook Clinical Manual and Review of Transesophageal Echocardiography, which is now in its 3rd edition. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Madhav Swaminathan, who will present his lecture titled Echo, Equity, and Empowerment, a Framework for the Future.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank the ASE Scientific Sessions Planning Committee for this incredible honor of delivering the 32nd Annual Edler Lecture at the 2021 meeting. I'm the first anesthesiologist to do this, but I hope I'll be the last one to give a virtual Edler lecture, and I hope to see you all at the 2022 meeting next year. So I'll be talking about echo, equity, and empowerment, a framework for the future. I have no relevant financial disclosures or conflicts of interest. So my goals for this talk are to discuss the evolution of equity in the field of echocardiography, to describe the importance of equity and empowerment for progress, and then review a framework for the success of the future of echocardiography. So as an outline, I'll start by reviewing a historical perspective, but more in the context of equity in the evolution of echo. And then we'll follow that up with a discussion on the value of equity, especially as it pertains to echo, and then the critical value of empowerment as it pertains to diversity and inclusion. And then we'll review a framework. We'll set the stage sort of for the future of echocardiography, and then followed by some summary thoughts at the end, my perspectives in other words. And as usual, you'll find a timeline at the bottom of the screen, which will help me and you navigate through the talk. So when we think about how it all started, a combination of engineering and cardiology in the form of Hertz and Edler. This was back in the 50s when in a Kokum shipyard in Malmö in Sweden, they put together a sonar machine and figured out how to use clinical ultrasound. And this was the beginning, really, in terms of how engineering and cardiology came together. And then there was recognition by other specialties at that time, with neurosurgeons and obstetricians coming together and utilizing the value of clinical ultrasound after its description in Sweden. This is a video courtesy of Dr. Kislow, which shows a young gentleman who's getting an echocardiogram at that time by Dr. Edler, assisted by a nurse. It's somehow strange as we see this video to see no masks on, but I hope we'll return to that sort of normalcy soon. And as you can see, these were early devices. This was a remarkable feat of engineering and clinical medicine put together. And this was really a combination of two fields and two specialists coming together to think outside the box and really think about how they can enhance the value of healthcare, specifically cardiovascular care, by leveraging the power of technology. Thinking outside the box, being disruptive, thinking about innovation. And then Claude Joyner joined hands with John Reed, who was an engineer at the time, to come up, and they also had this medical student by the name of James Bond, fittingly, to publish the first use of clinical ultrasound in the United States. And this was published in Circulation back in 1963. And of course, our own Dr. Feigenbaum, the founder of the American Society of Echo, published first in March 1965 the ultrasound diagnosis of pericardial effusion. But he did that along with a surgeon who had a dog lab, who had a canine lab, where they used experiments with ultrasound and pericardial effusion. So again, this whole thing came about by different people from different fields collaborating to produce this wonderful technology we call echocardiography. But the word echocardiography didn't really start at that time. It came up when Bernard Siegel from Philadelphia coined the term echocardiography, and still they were calling it ultrasound cardiography at the time, and this was published in January 1967. Coincidentally, the year I was born. And then Ray Gramiak, who was a radiologist, continued using echocardiography and was one of the pioneers of contrast ultrasound. And he essentially also was one of those who was a pioneer or founder of the American Society of Echocardiography and was the first vice president. Now, this is another example of how radiology also was in the mix, and then we were talking at that time about cardiologists, engineers, radiologists coming together to produce ultrasound. And of course, by the 70s and 80s, cardiologists were doing great tips and tricks. They were trying to do this even with their eyes closed. This is Dr. Alan Perlman, one of the former presidents of ASE, who said he could do it with his eyes closed. And when I asked him, I said, Dr. Perlman, could you send me an early pic of your lab? This is the picture I got. And then he also talked to me about how ASE organized initially. And it was all around advocacy to start with. But then they had to find a home and scientific sessions to hold. And earlier they used to meet at the American Heart Association annual meetings, and this was in 1984. You can see Dr. Kislow here, who was the fourth president of ASE, and Dr. DeMaria, who was the fifth president. And yes, even at that time, Dr. DeMaria was upset with Dr. Kislow, as you can see in this picture. But then came anesthesia. And these were the early pioneers of perioperative echo. When anesthesia came into the mix, you're talking about another specialty that sort of entered the field of clinical ultrasound. This is Dr. Daniel Tice, who did a great job and was one of the pioneers at Columbia in New York. Fiona Clements and Norbert de Bruin at Duke. The late Mike Cahalan at UCSF and the University of Utah. Saul Aronson at the University of Chicago and then at Duke. And Bob Savage at the Cleveland Clinic. And these guys really helped create perioperative echo in collaboration, in partnership with some amazing cardiologists who were supportive and helped them along the way. And of course, by the time Pam Douglas came onto the field, and she just loved this whole thing, the POCUS Revolution was just beginning as far as ASE is concerned. But Pam Douglas was at that sort of inflection point in the history of American Society of Echo. But at that time, the circle of trust, so to speak, with echocardiography was with cardiology mainly, and anesthesia was let in at the time, with perioperative echo just beginning to sort of take its roots. And then the POCUS Revolution hit. This was around 2003, when the ASE really started considering what's going on with this handheld echo stuff. And this was one of the first publications that looked at the value of echocardiography or handheld ultrasound, point-of-care ultrasound for cardiac diagnoses in the emergency department. This was back in 95. And with a combination of Metamucil and Jello, Lowe et al. Did a homemade ultrasound phantom, but came up with the term POCUS for the first time that was in published literature back in 2012. The ASE came up in 2010 with some guidelines along with the American College of Emergency Physicians on focused cardiac ultrasound in the emergent setting. And now it's everywhere. POCUS is being used just about everywhere that you can see. But while we're growing the family, a little word about how Jonathan Lindner, one of the past presidents of the ASE, was instrumental in inclusivity when he included the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine and the cardiovascular specialists there to join in the fold with ASE. And since then, we've had a great inclusion of veterinary cardiovascular physicians and specialists in the ASE. So that's been another great addition. But in my discussions with Pam Douglas, she said, technology wants to be free, and technology will be free, and it would be not in our power actually to curtail that. Dr. Kislow and Dr. Jha, who's a radiologist, talked to me about how technology follows the patient. And certainly when patients with certain diseases, especially cardiovascular diseases, go to different kind of specialists, the imaging technology that will facilitate cardiovascular care will follow them. So it's going to go without being, it'll be agnostic of specialty or the specialist who practices ultrasound. But as long as ultrasound remains valuable, it will go into different hands. And we've got to realize that. So in that sort of journey of ultrasound, right from the beginning of engineers to radiologists, cardiologists, anesthesiologists, veterinary medicine, and POCUS, what's next? And when we think about what's next, we have to think about what deep learning and artificial intelligence is bringing in. This was a publication earlier this year by some good friends of mine, Akhil Narang, Neil Weissman, Jim Thomas, Roberto Lang, and they talked about a deep learning algorithm to guide novices, that is untrained people, to acquire ultrasound images. And this can go as far as not just medical professionals, but patients themselves. This was a BBC News item. So while the ASE tries to put all of our growing family of practitioners under one roof with ASE Cares, we've got to realize that this family is growing. But we're also talking about the democratization of ultrasound. And here's an example of wearable ultrasound devices. This was published way back in 2004. So the technology and the ideas were also present at that time. Here's another publication of wearable ultrasound array for point-of-care imaging and patient monitoring. This was in 2016. And then very recently, a few years ago, Canadian researchers developed a wearable ultrasound scanner. And this was on the basis of this article in Nature Microsystems and Nanoengineering, where they developed a small Band-Aid sized ultrasound transducer, which could be used as a wearable by patients. And so when we're talking about growing the family, we're talking about a pretty large family coming up. But let's switch gears a little bit towards equity. And why equity, and why is that important in this discussion here? Now, Martin Luther King Jr. in 1966 said that of all forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. While I'm not really talking about healthcare delivery per se, I'm talking about healthcare equity from the healthcare provider's perspective. And when we think about value of equity, these three figures really convey it all. When we think about inequality, it's unequal access to opportunities. But equality, is that really evenly distributed tools and assistance? Is that sufficient? No, but equity is, and that's custom tools that identify and address inequality. And that's really the important part. But here we are not talking about diversity alone, because diversity is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And what diversity must be accompanied by is inclusion, is equity, and is empowerment of those groups that leads to belonging. Now, Werner Myers, a speaker, a public figure who is a motivational speaker, talked about diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. It's an oft-quoted quote, but I would add to that belonging, though, is being able to dance like no one's watching. And that becomes an important part of what we are trying to do. We're trying to make everyone feel a sense of belonging to whichever group they've joined. And at ASE, that couldn't be more true. Now, what about equity and value? So what is the value of equity? And when we think about this, organizations or professional societies that encourage equity, it leads to a feeling of more achievement by its members, more retention of employees. It's attractive as an organization for more talented people to join. You develop intellectual capital, and it's good for the bottom line. Several research articles and research works sort of speak to this or are testament to this. And then in this survey done on almost a little more than 4,500 healthcare workers, they looked at diversity and trust, and they were intricately interrelated. But what modified them was the feeling of inclusion and equity. So why echocardiography? When we think again of how ASE is trying to build this circle and keep this circle intact, equity becomes central to that discussion. Because again, we've got to forget what a turf is all about, because we keep arguing about turf and different specialists will argue about turf all the time. But remember, we're all in one turf, and that belongs to the patient, and we're all in it. And so it would really serve us well to forget that sort of turf war and think about how even at the origins of echocardiography, if it wasn't for equity between radar and echocardiography, we would never be where we are today. And so it's helpful to remember that equity is central to what we do and is central to our mission, which is advancing ultrasound, cardiovascular ultrasound. And so when we think about empowerment, this is where it's really important, because our workforce is changing. The character of the workforce, the nature of the workforce, the age of the workforce is going to change, and it's already changed forever. But in academic medicine, we seem to be lagging behind quite a bit, with our diversity efforts not really producing the fruit that we want to see over time. And here's an example of an academic medicine, the faculty workforce. So we're still lagging behind, although we keep talking a lot about diversity. But remember, diversity requires policy, which we have. Inclusion and equity requires leadership, which we want. So when we think about diversity and we think about inclusion, we've got to enable that with empowerment, which is giving a voice and a platform to those who want to leverage the power of ultrasound for better cardiovascular health. And that is empowerment. Now, how is ASE doing in terms of empowerment? So from its origin in 1975 to now, it took about until 1993 when we started having councils. And that included sonography, peds, and peri-op. That started off in 1993. And then came 2006 when we added vascular. And now we're at 2021. So what's going on with diversity and inclusion, and especially empowerment? So now, thanks to Dr. Neil Weissman's leadership in the governance committee, we now have specialty interest groups that were recently created about a year ago. And so far, we've got 5 groups. We've got critical care echo, we've got emerging echo enthusiasts, we have interventional echo, neonatal hemodynamics, and cardio-oncology. And this family is growing. And the whole idea is to be more inclusive, and not only just inclusive, but to give each one of these groups the ability to talk, to discuss, to develop, to innovate, to add. And that's the criteria, and that's the value. But that doesn't just stop at special interest group. We developed, just recently this year, a few months ago, we launched the Women in Echo group. And this was a great discussion that they had initially. This was, I think, about a couple of months ago. And then the ASE Leadership Academy. Look at the diversity and inclusion here. This is building ASE's future leaders. Like I said earlier, the emerging echo enthusiasts is one special interest group that is really producing a lot of content which is relevant for our younger generation. So really, this is the democratization of echocardiography. But let's move on to a framework for success. And how do we achieve success in terms of, getting equity to power the next few decades of echocardiography? So when we think about that sort of pyramid structure, that foundation, that framework, we've got to make it a core value. We've got to build capacity. We have to integrate it into our culture. We have to share experiences, and we have to hold each other accountable. So when we think about making it a core value, at ASE, the board of directors gathered on November 24, 2019, and articulated our new framework for the next 5 years, the next 5-year plan. And these were our core values that we articulated and that we came up with in a solid policy document. This is what we'll do every time. We want to build capacity. So the examples that I gave earlier were examples of capacity, but even in your organizations, in echocardiography, in cardiovascular health in general, we must have targeted mentorship programs. We must have specific grant opportunities, focused career development in echocardiography, and skills development. We've got to welcome new users, in fact, encourage them and empower them to leverage the power of technology, specifically cardiovascular ultrasound, and take it into new directions wherever that might lead. We have to integrate it into our culture. It has to become a part of everything that we do. We must try and share experiences. The Women in Echo was a great example of that. We have meetings all the time where we share our experiences and learn from each other. This is an example of an ACC-led diversity group that I spoke at. And then here's another example of a neurodiversity discussion where we were talking about the challenges of neurodiversity and how to incorporate a neurodiverse angle into your diversity efforts. And finally, we must add accountability, where we must hold our leaders accountable. And this can be through things like annual reports, or even diversity and inclusion and equity dashboards, such as the one at the Harvard School, John Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. This is there on their website. So this is where we hold each other, and especially leaders, accountable to create that change. And that whole framework for success will be enabled once we get everything in place and we can leverage that power of technology through equity and empowerment. So the fundamental concept, when we think about shared decisions, we think about safe decisions and we think about disruptive decisions. And when we talk about guidelines, they certainly tend to be in that safe direction. They tend to safeguard our interests and our professional sort of society or organizational. And then we talk about consensus. When we rule with consensus, we're talking about building more safety into the culture. And then when something like COVID hits, for example, we go into crisis management where there's more disruptive thinking, there's less consensus perhaps, and more out-of-the-box thinking. But innovation truly requires out-of-the-box thinking, more disruptive thinking, being less safe. And ASE is in the middle of all this. And for any organization to be successful, you've got to embrace this entire spectrum, right from safe to the disruptive. And you can't lean just one way or the other, but you've got to embrace the entire spectrum if our core mission is to be met and cardiovascular ultrasound is to be more successful. So I'll end up with some key points. Echocardiography was created by equity. Diversity requires policy, but inclusion requires leadership. Equity and inclusion are mission critical to any organization, including the ASE. But remember to empower those that you include. And of course, remember those words of Pam Douglas, technology wants to be free. I want to thank Pam Douglas for her incredible guidance in this, for this talk, and Joe Kisler for walking me down memory lane on this, Alan Perlman, who provided some great information to me, and Saurabh Jha, who gave me that radiologist's perspective. But these two Josephs, my boss included, who have been critical to my success at Duke, and to all the trainees and teachers I've had over the years who also have been instrumental in making sure that echocardiography and perioperative echo have thrived along the way. And of course, the woman who makes it all possible and the men who make it all worthwhile. Thank you so much.
Dr. Swaminathan, thank you for your inspiring lecture. As I previously mentioned, the Edler Lecture was created in 1990 to honor Inge Edler, the founder of cardiac ultrasound over 50 years ago. ASE is pleased to present Dr. Swaminathan with a copy of Dr. Edler's original thesis as a thank you. And now, on to the rest of Day 3